My name is Nina Alvarez, and I was 28 years old when it happened. This story isn't one I tell often, and I wouldn't blame you for doubting me. I might doubt it myself if I didn't live through it. It was supposed to be a weekend trip, a chance to mend the fragile bond with my younger brother Diego, who was 22 at the time. Instead, it became a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. It was late October, and the air in New Mexico carried a sharp chill. We were headed to a remote section of Palo Duro Canyon, a rugged slice of wilderness far from cell towers and the comforting glow of civilization. Joining us were my best friend Casey Green, a no-nonsense nurse with a knack for keeping people grounded, and Aaron Holt, a guy I didn't know too well but who Diego insisted was essential for survival. Diego had always been restless, full of snark and a burning need to prove himself. He barely spoke to me as we packed our RV. The wounds of my absence during our parents' deaths still festered between us. I hoped this trip would heal them. The drive to the canyon was uneventful, though Diego spent most of it bickering with Aaron about how best to prepare for the trip. Aaron, ever the self-styled outdoorsman, insisted we didn't need much food or water because we could forage and filter. I had packed extra supplies, knowing better than to trust his bravado. Casey rolled her eyes at every boast he made, muttering under her breath, "This guy's gonna get us killed." The first day was beautiful. We set up camp near the edge of a cliff that offered a stunning view of the canyon. The air was crisp. The sunsets painted the sky in fiery oranges and reds, and for a moment, I thought maybe this trip would go smoothly. Then the second night came. I woke to silence. Not the peaceful, restful kind, but an oppressive absence of sound. No wind rustled the sagebrush, no crickets chirped, no distant coyotes howled. Just silence, heavy and unnatural. I stepped outside the RV, clutching my jacket. The moonlight bathed the canyon in an eerie silver glow. That's when I saw them. Tracks in the dirt near our campsite. They were clawed, almost humanoid, but too large to belong to any animal I knew. "Diego!" I hissed, shaking him awake. He groaned, but followed me outside, rubbing his eyes. "Jesus, what made those?" he muttered, crouching to get a closer look. Aaron joined us, his flashlight illuminating the tracks. "Probably a mountain lion," he said, but the way his voice wavered told me he didn't believe it. Casey appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. "Mountain lions don't leave prints like that," she said flatly. "And what's with the silence? It's like everything's hiding from something." We decided to stay close to the RV for the night, chalking it up to our imaginations. But deep down, I felt something watching us. The next day, Diego wandered off, despite my warnings. He returned at sunset, looking pale. "Did you guys call my name earlier?" he asked, his voice unsteady. "No," I said, exchanging a glance with Casey. "Why?" "I heard someone calling me from the canyon," he said, avoiding my eyes. "Sounded like you, Nina." A chill ran down my spine. "Don't wander off again," I snapped, my worry boiling over into anger. Aaron tried to lighten the mood by stoking the campfire and telling ghost stories, but even he seemed uneasy. That night, as the fire died down, we heard faint whispers carried on the wind. They were too soft to make out, but unmistakably human. Casey grabbed my arm. "Tell me, I'm not hearing things." "I hear it too," I whispered. Diego's face was pale, his bravado gone. Aaron, usually quick to offer an explanation, was silent. By the third day, the tension was unbearable. We discovered an animal carcass near our camp. A deer, its body mangled in ways that didn't make sense. The wounds were too precise, almost surgical. Diego swore he saw something moving in the trees, but when we looked, there was nothing there. That evening, the whispers grew louder. They came from all directions, circling us. I stayed close to the fire, clutching the small bundle of sage I'd brought, a habit from my days guiding tours in Native American lands. Casey sat beside me, her flashlight trembling in her hands. Then Aaron disappeared. We noticed his absence when the fire had burned low. His tent was empty, his boots gone. Diego admitted he'd seen Aaron walking toward the canyon's edge but hadn't stopped him, thinking he was going to the bathroom. We searched for Aaron, calling his name, our voices echoing against the canyon walls. That's when we saw him. Or what looked like him. He stood at the edge of the cliff, his back to us. "Aaron!" Diego shouted, running toward him. "No!" I grabbed Diego, pulling him back. Something about Aaron was wrong. His posture was too rigid, his movements unnatural. Slowly, he turned to face us. His eyes glowed, reflecting the firelight like an animal's. His mouth twisted into a grin that didn't belong on a human face. Then he dropped to all fours, his limbs bending in ways they shouldn't, and let out a guttural growl. We ran. Back at the RV, I lit the sage bundle, waving it in the air as I recited a protection prayer I'd learned from a Navajo elder years ago. The creature circled our campsite, its glowing eyes watching us from the shadows. It mimicked Aaron's voice, calling out to us, pleading for help. "We can't stay here," Casey said, her voice shaking. "It's toying with us." "We can't leave Aaron," Diego protested. But even he seemed unsure. "That's not Aaron anymore," I said, my voice breaking. "We have to go." As we piled into the RV, the creature lunged. Its clawed hand scraped the side of the vehicle, leaving deep gouges in the metal. Diego floored the gas, the tires spinning in the dirt before catching traction. The RV barreled down the rough road, the creature chasing us, its inhuman gait relentless. It slammed into the back of the RV, rocking it violently. Casey screamed. I grabbed the sage and threw the smoldering bundle out the window, hoping it would deter the thing. To my relief, it stopped in its tracks, snarling as the smoke engulfed it. But the relief was short-lived. It watched us from the hill as we drove away, its glowing eyes a reminder that we'd escaped, but only just. We reported the incident to the authorities, but they dismissed it as hysteria. Aaron was never found. Diego and I finally reconciled, but the experience left scars on us both. I don't camp anymore, and I haven't set foot in Palo Duro Canyon since. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear whispers outside my window, soft and distant. I tell myself it's the wind, but deep down, I know it's not. My name is Caleb Hunter. I was 40 years old when it happened, and not a day goes by that I don't think about it. At the time, I was a writer struggling with writer's block and a heavy dose of grief after losing my wife, Lydia, to cancer the year before. I thought the solitude of Lincoln National Forest, deep in the heart of New Mexico, would help me find inspiration for my next novel, a thriller I planned to base on local legends. Instead, it nearly cost me my life. It was late September when I pulled my RV into a remote trailhead off a dusty dirt road. The spot wasn't on any official maps, but a local had tipped me off about it, saying it was peaceful and untouched. It was exactly what I thought I needed. No cell service, no distractions, just the quiet hum of nature. The first few days were uneventful. I hiked the trails during the day and spent my evenings at the RV, jotting down notes and outlines for the novel. The story revolved around a mysterious forest spirit, the Watcher, as the locals called it. The legend fascinated me, a dark, shadowy figure that marked its victims with spirals before driving them mad. Of course, I didn't believe in such things. I was a man of logic, not superstition. The first sign that something was off came on the third night. I woke to a sound, scratching, faint but deliberate, against the window of the RV. Groggy, I stumbled out of bed and peered into the darkness. The moonlight illuminated the dense pines, casting long, jagged shadows. But there was nothing there. No raccoons, no wind, nothing that could explain the sound. The next morning, I found rocks arranged in a spiral around the RV. It was so precise, so deliberate, that it couldn't have been an accident. I told myself it was a prank. Maybe a couple of hikers messing with the guy who thought it was a good idea to park out here alone. But there were no other campers. No footprints other than my own. On the fifth day, I decided to hike deeper into the woods, hoping to clear my mind. That's when I met her. She appeared out of nowhere. A girl, maybe 10 or 11, barefoot and wearing a faded white dress. Her hair was tangled, and her face was smudged with dirt. She stood motionless on the trail, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. "Are you lost?" I asked, keeping my voice gentle. She shook her head but didn't speak. "Where are your parents?" Again, no answer. She just turned and walked off the trail, vanishing into the trees. I called after her, but she didn't stop. Something about her unsettled me, but I convinced myself she was a local kid playing in the woods. Still, when I returned to the RV, I radioed the forest ranger station. Ranger Elena Chavez answered. Her voice crackled through the static. "No reports of a missing child," she said. "But be careful, Mr. Hunter. That area has a history." "What kind of history?" I asked. She hesitated before replying. "Just don't wander too far from your RV." That night, the scratching returned, louder this time. I bolted upright in bed, heart pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it at the window. For a moment, I thought I saw a face, a pale, gaunt face with glowing eyes. But it disappeared as quickly as it appeared. I stepped outside, flashlight in hand, and froze. The spiral of rocks was back, but this time it was larger, stretching out from the RV in a perfect circle. The air was thick with the stench of sulfur, and the forest was deathly silent. That's when I saw the figure. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its body shrouded in shadow. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. As I stared, it raised a clawed hand and pointed at me. By the next morning, I was ready to leave. I packed my belongings, started the RV's engine, and nothing happened. It refused to turn over, despite having worked perfectly the day before. Panic set in as I tried the engine again and again, to no avail. Desperate, I radioed Ranger Elena, but the static drowned out her response. All I caught was a single word: run. As night fell, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, indistinct murmurs carried on the wind, but they grew louder, circling the RV like a chorus of unseen voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I heard my name. "Caleb." It was Lydia's voice. I couldn't stay inside any longer. Clutching a lighter and a bundle of sage I had brought for inspiration, I stepped into the clearing. The spirals were everywhere now, carved into the trees, etched into the dirt, even scratched into the side of the RV. The watcher stood at the edge of the clearing, its glowing eyes locked onto me. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, my voice breaking. It didn't answer. It didn't need to. I understood then that it fed on fear, on despair, and I had given it plenty. Lila appeared again, standing between me and the watcher. "You have to leave," she whispered, her voice urgent, "before he marks you forever." "I can't," I said, gesturing to the dead RV. "I'm stuck." She pointed to the spirals. "Burn them. It's the only way." I didn't hesitate. I lit the sage and set fire to the nearest spiral. The flames spread quickly, consuming the dry brush and igniting the carvings on the trees. The watcher screamed, a high-pitched, inhuman sound that made my ears bleed, and retreated into the shadows. The clearing was an inferno, the heat searing my skin as I stumbled back toward the RV. Somehow, the engine roared to life, and I didn't question it. I drove as fast as I could, leaving the flames and the spirals behind. Ranger Elena found me near the main road the next morning. I must have looked like a madman, covered in soot, babbling about spirals and shadows. She didn't ask questions, just escorted me to safety. I never saw Lila again, and no one believed my story. The RV was damaged beyond repair, but I didn't care. I sold it and left New Mexico for good. But the spirals stayed with me. They appear in my dreams, in the shadows of trees, even in the lines of my handwriting. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I hear whispers. They're calling my name. My name is Marcy Lane. I was 37 years old when I went looking for answers about the worst day of my life. It was supposed to be a simple trip, a chance to confront my past and maybe find some kind of closure. Instead, I found something far darker in the San Mateo Mountains, something I can't unsee. It started with a map. I found it while cleaning out a box of old things from my teenage years. The map was from a camping trip I took with my best friend Beth when we were 15. It had our planned routes marked in bright red marker, complete with silly notes like Marcy's shortcut and Beth's waterfall. Seeing it brought a rush of memories, good ones at first, then the bad. Beth disappeared on that trip. One moment we were laughing and exploring the forest, and the next, she was gone. No trace, no explanation. For years, I told myself it was an accident. She must have fallen, gotten lost, or been taken by some predator. But a part of me always wondered if it was something more. Something wrong. When I saw that map, it felt like a sign. I packed my RV and drove to the San Mateo Mountains, determined to retrace our route and face whatever had haunted me for over 20 years. I reached the trailhead just before sunset. The air was cool and the mountains loomed above me, their jagged peaks catching the last light of the day. It had been years since I'd been here, but the place felt unchanged, timeless, almost frozen. As I parked the RV, a man appeared from the trees. He was old, with a wiry frame and a scraggly gray beard. His clothes were worn, and his eyes were sharp, taking in every detail of me and my vehicle. "You don't want to camp here," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Why not?" I asked, trying to sound braver than I felt. He spat on the ground and pointed toward the mountains. "That's the devil's playground up there. You go in, you don't come out the same." I forced a smile. "Thanks for the warning, but I'll be fine." He didn't argue. He just shook his head and disappeared into the trees, leaving me alone with his words echoing in my mind. That night, I couldn't sleep. The RV felt too quiet, the forest outside too still. I kept hearing little sounds, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but when I looked out the window there was nothing there. Just darkness. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke to the sound of tapping. It was faint at first, like raindrops on the window, but it grew louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it outside. The beam cut through the dark, revealing trees and underbrush. Nothing else. The tapping stopped. The next morning, I found strange markings on the trees near the RV. They were spirals, etched deep into the bark, each one about the size of a dinner plate. I didn't remember seeing them the day before, but maybe I'd been too distracted. I shrugged it off as some kind of prank. Maybe kids messing around, or campers leaving behind their mark. Still, the sight of them made my skin crawl. As I followed the map deeper into the forest, I noticed more carvings. They were on almost every tree now. Spirals, overlapping spirals, growing larger and more chaotic. It felt like the forest was trying to tell me something, but I didn't want to listen. By the second day, the sense of unease had grown into something heavier. The air felt thick, like I was walking through water. Even the light seemed strange, muted, as if the trees were sucking it in. And then I heard it. Marcy. It was faint, carried on the wind, but unmistakable. It was Beth's voice. I froze, my heart pounding. "Beth," I called out. Silence. I stood there for what felt like hours, straining to hear it again. When nothing came, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. The mind plays tricks in the woods, I told myself, but deep down, I knew better. On the third day, I reached the clearing. It was exactly as I remembered it. A circle of jagged rocks surrounded by gnarled, twisted trees. The place we'd set up camp all those years ago. At first, it looked untouched. But as I walked closer, I saw them. Personal items scattered across the ground. A rusted camping stove, a torn sleeping bag, an old pair of boots, the leather cracked and brittle. They weren't mine or Beth's, but they had been here a long time. And then I saw her. Beth was standing at the edge of the clearing, her back to me. She looked exactly as she had the day she disappeared. 15 years old, her hair in a ponytail, wearing the same blue hoodie and jeans. My breath caught in my throat. "Beth?" I whispered. She turned slowly, her face blank, her eyes black as coal. A cruel smile spread across her lips. Before I could move, the illusion shattered. Beth's form melted away, replaced by something monstrous. The thing standing before me was tall and gaunt, its limbs impossibly long and its skin stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes burned with a mocking light, and its mouth twisted into a grin that didn't belong on any human face. "You came back!" it hissed, its voice a grotesque imitation of Beth's. "You couldn't let go." I stumbled back, my hands shaking. "What do you want?" It laughed, a sound that echoed in my head like nails on a chalkboard. "To play." The trickster raised one clawed hand, and the world around me shifted. The clearing was gone, replaced by a twisting maze of trees and shadows. No matter which way I turned, the paths seemed to close behind me, forcing me deeper into the labyrinth. I heard Beth's voice again, crying out for help. I knew it wasn't real, but I couldn't stop myself from following it. Each step pulled me further into the trap, the shadows growing darker, the air colder. Somewhere along the way, I found Beth's compass in my pocket. I didn't remember bringing it, but the sight of it grounded me. It was old and scratched, but it still pointed north. Clinging to that small sense of direction, I pushed forward. Eventually, I stumbled back into the clearing. The trickster was waiting, its grin wider than ever. "You can't leave," it said, its voice low and guttural. "You belong here." I gripped the compass tightly and took a deep breath. "No," I said, "I don't." Before it could react, I grabbed a canister of fuel from the RV and poured it over the clearing. I lit a match and threw it into the center. The flames roared to life, consuming the spirals and the twisted trees. The trickster screamed, its form writhing in the firelight. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I jumped into the RV, started the engine, somehow it worked, and drove as fast as I could, leaving the Devil's Playground behind. I never found Beth. I didn't expect to, but for the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of peace, like I'd finally laid something to rest. Months later, a package arrived at my door. Inside was Beth's old camping gear, perfectly preserved. There was no note, no explanation. just the faint smell of sulfur. I don't camp anymore, I don't go near the mountains. But some nights, when the wind blows just right, I hear her voice. And I wonder if the playground is calling me back. My name is Mia Harington. I'm 28 years old, a part-time wilderness guide, and until last year I thought I'd seen it all in the great outdoors. This story happened in late October, deep in the Gila National Forest in New Mexico. It was supposed to be a week-long trip to reconnect with my boyfriend, Daniel. Instead, it turned into something I barely survived, and I still can't explain. Daniel had convinced me to take the trip, framing it as a way for us to reset after months of drifting apart. He was 30, an avid outdoorsman, and probably the most stubborn person I'd ever met. Our plan was simple. Load up the RV, park near the Gila Wilderness Trailhead, and hike to some remote spots for camping. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, but something about the forest felt heavy. Not dangerous exactly, but oppressive, like the trees were leaning in, watching. At the last gas station, a wiry old man behind the counter raised his eyebrows when Daniel told him where we were heading. "You be careful out there," he said, handing back Daniel's change. "The hunger of the forest doesn't care how tough you think you are." Daniel chuckled. "Let me guess, some local ghost story?" The man didn't smile. "Not a story, just be respectful and stick to the marked trails." I didn't think much of it then. Folklore is common in wilderness areas. Still, I pocketed the map he handed us with a faint sense of unease. The first day on the trail was uneventful, though Daniel's enthusiasm was infectious. We set up camp under a canopy of towering pines, and for the first time in weeks, we really talked, about where we were headed in life. That night, as we lay in the tent, I woke to the sound of twigs snapping. At first, I thought it was an animal, but the noises were deliberate, like someone, or something, was circling the campsite. I nudged Daniel awake, but he groggily waved me off. "It's just deer," he mumbled. "Go back to sleep." I didn't sleep much after that. By the second day, the trail started to feel less familiar. The dense trees closed in around us, and landmarks on the map didn't seem to match our surroundings. Daniel brushed it off, saying, "These trails shift all the time. We're fine." That afternoon, we stumbled upon something odd. Claw marks on the bark of a pine tree, deep and jagged, too high to have been made by any bear. "Mountain lion," Daniel said confidently, though his voice wavered. "Mountain lions don't leave marks like that," I replied. "Then what? Bigfoot?" He laughed, but the sound was forced. The unease grew that night. As we sat by the fire, the forest seemed too quiet, as if the usual rustle of animals had vanished. When we turned in, I made sure to double-check the tent's zippers and our food stash. I woke to the sound of my own voice. "Mia!" It whispered from just outside the tent, barely audible. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was impossible. Daniel was asleep beside me, snoring softly. "Mia, come here," it said again. Clearer this time. I shook Daniel awake. "Someone's outside." He grabbed his flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the beam into the dark. Nothing. No footprints in the dirt, no rustling of branches, just silence. "You imagined it," he said, but his face was pale. The third day brought more tension. I wanted to turn back, but Daniel insisted we push deeper into the forest. "We've come this far," he argued. "Besides, it's just weird sounds. There's nothing out here but us." But I knew he didn't believe that. His confidence was starting to crack. That afternoon, we found a deer carcass, mangled and half-rotten. Flies buzzed around it, but the body was untouched by scavengers. "Let's keep moving," Daniel said quickly. That night, the whispers returned, louder this time. They didn't just mimic my voice, they used his, too. "Daniel, help me," the voice begged from the woods. I grabbed his arm. "That's not me. Don't you dare go out there." But he was already reaching for the zipper, his face a mix of confusion and fear. I had to grab him hard to keep him from stepping into the darkness. The fourth night was the worst. We built a large fire hoping to keep whatever it was at bay. But as the hours passed, the shadows seemed to grow thicker, moving unnaturally between the trees. It came into view just after midnight. Tall, impossibly thin, with glowing yellow eyes and a deer-like skull for a head, the creature stepped into the edge of the firelight. Its movements were jerky, wrong, as if it didn't belong in this world. Daniel froze. "What the hell is that?" "It's real," I whispered, grabbing a burning branch from the fire. The creature didn't attack, not immediately. It circled us, its glowing eyes locked on Daniel. When it finally lunged, I swung the branch wildly, the flames making it recoil with an unearthly scream. At dawn, we packed up what little we could carry and ran. Trails that should have led back to the RV were gone, replaced by unfamiliar terrain. It was as if the forest itself was twisting, keeping us trapped. The Wendigo followed, always just out of sight, its guttural growls echoing in the distance. I remembered the old man's words. The hunger of the forest doesn't care how tough you think you are. Finally, we stumbled onto a dirt road where a passing ranger found us. He looked at our ragged faces and simply nodded, as if he already knew what we'd encountered. Daniel hasn't spoken much about that trip since. He doesn't hike anymore. I've gone back to the woods, but never to Gila National Forest. The forest isn't just trees and trails. It has memories, and sometimes those memories are hungry. If you ever find yourself out there and hear a familiar voice in the dark, don't follow it. Some things are best left unanswered. My name is Olivia Marx, and I'm 34 years old. I've spent most of my adult life chasing stories, documenting the forgotten and unusual corners of America through my blog, Wanderlost, which focuses on solo RV camping adventures. This story happened last October, during what I thought would be a quick stop at an abandoned campground near Harington, New Mexico, Shadow Creek Campground. Even now, the name sends a shiver through me. I thought I was chasing a quirky legend to spice up my blog, maybe even debunk some ghost stories. Instead, I found myself trapped in something I can't explain, something I'm not sure I escaped entirely. It was late afternoon when I pulled my RV into the empty, overgrown lot of Shadow Creek. The campground was secluded, surrounded by thick trees and the winding creek for which it was named. The setting sun bathed the area in golden light, making the eerie graffiti on the collapsing RVs and rusting playground equipment almost picturesque. I parked near what must have once been the main office. The building was nothing more than a sagging skeleton of wood and broken windows. I grabbed my camera and started snapping photos, noting the eerie juxtaposition of nature reclaiming the area. The swing set creaked lazily in the breeze, its chains corroded with rust. "This'll make a great post," I muttered to myself, taking a shot of the graffiti scrawled across an old camper. They never left. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped quickly. After setting up camp and making a quick meal, I settled into my RV to sort through the day's photos. The isolation was exactly what I'd wanted. No tourists, no noise, just me and the remnants of a forgotten place. Around midnight, as I was dozing off, I heard it. Faint laughter. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The sound was distant, almost drowned out by the babble of the creek, but it was unmistakable. Children laughing. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the empty campground. The swing set swayed gently, though there was no wind, and the laughter faded into silence. "Just coyotes," I said aloud, trying to convince myself. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I woke to a strange sight. Small, muddy footprints circling my RV. They led toward the playground and stopped abruptly at the base of the slide. The prints were too small for an adult, and there hadn't been any cars or other signs of visitors. "It's just some animals," I told myself. But my voice was unconvincing. I grabbed my camera and documented the prints, adding a note to my blog draft about the campground's unsettling atmosphere. Later, I decided to explore the abandoned RVs. Inside one, I found an old photo album tucked under a pile of debris. The pictures were faded, but still clear enough to make out smiling children and camp counselors posing for group shots. On the last page, scrawled in red marker, were the words, "Camp ends, 1985. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Something about the handwriting felt wrong, jagged, desperate. As the sun set, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My phone, fully charged that morning, now refused to turn on. My camera lens fogged over every time I tried to take a picture near the playground. That night, I heard them again. "Olivia," a child's voice whispered. I froze, gripping the flashlight tighter. "Come play with us," it said. Clearer now, coming from outside the RV. I peeked through the window. For a moment, I saw them. Shadowy figures darting between the trees, too quick to follow. When I stepped outside, the air felt heavier, thicker, as if the forest were closing in. "Muddy footprints," I whispered to myself, shining the flashlight on the ground. Sure enough, they were back, circling the RV and leading to the playground once more. The next morning, I delved deeper into Shadow Creek's history. Through spotty Wi-Fi and old local forums, I pieced together the story. In 1985, a group of children drowned in the creek during a late-night hike. The tragedy closed the campground for good. Locals claimed the creek called to the children, but no one could explain how they ended up in the water. The legend went deeper. People said the children never left, that their laughter could still be heard on quiet nights. Some even claimed they'd seen muddy footprints around the abandoned playground, just like the ones I'd found. That night, the air felt electric, charged with something I couldn't name. I locked the RV doors and windows, hoping to keep whatever was out there at bay. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that made my blood run cold. Small hands tapping on the RV windows. Tap, tap, tap. "Olivia," a voice called. "Come outside, we just want to play." I sat frozen, clutching my flashlight, refusing to move. Suddenly, the RV shook violently, as if something, or several somethings, were clawing at it. I shone the flashlight through the window and screamed. Tiny handprints covered the glass, smeared in what looked like mud. They were on the outside and the inside. I couldn't stay. Grabbing my keys, I started the RV and tried to drive out, but the engine sputtered and died. The laughter outside grew louder, almost deafening. "Stay with us," the voices chanted. "Stay forever." I stumbled outside with my lantern, desperate to face whatever this was. As I approached the playground, the temperature plummeted, and the shadowy figures emerged again. This time, they were clearer. Pale, translucent children with hollow eyes, their smiles wide and unnatural. "I know what happened to you," I said, my voice trembling. "I'll tell your story. I'll make sure no one forgets you." For a moment, they hesitated. Their faces softened and the laughter stopped. But then the tallest figure stepped forward, its grin widening impossibly. "Stories aren't enough," it hissed. "We want you." The spirit surged toward me, and I fell back, clutching the lantern. In a desperate move, I hurled it at the swing set, setting the overgrown grass ablaze. The fire roared, and the figures shrieked, their forms dissolving into the smoke. I didn't wait to see if they were gone for good. At dawn, I managed to start the RV and drive away, leaving the cursed campground behind. I haven't gone back, and I never will. I wrote about Shadow Creek on my blog, warning others to stay away. The post went viral, sparking debates between skeptics and believers. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear faint laughter. And every so often, when I wake up, there are handprints on my windows, always on the inside. My name is Sarah Whitman, and I'm 41 years old. I'm a geologist and a solo traveler, someone who prefers the quiet company of ancient rocks to the noise of modern cities. Last spring, I set out in my RV to explore a remote area of Lincoln National Forest in New Mexico. Mescalero Ridge was my destination, a place known for its dramatic volcanic rock formations and dark local legends. I didn't believe the stories, of course. I never do. That trip taught me that not all legends are lies. The drive to Mescalero Ridge was uneventful. I parked my RV at a small clearing at the base of the ridge, far from the nearest campground. The isolation was perfect. As the sun set, the shadows of jagged cliffs stretched over the land, giving the area an almost alien feel. I was here to study the unique volcanic rocks, but there was something about the silence that unnerved me. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an unnatural stillness that made the air feel heavy. I ignored it, attributing the feeling to my excitement about being in such an untouched location. As I set up my equipment, an old park ranger appeared from the trailhead. He looked tired, his uniform dusty and his eyes sharp. "Not many people come up here," he said, his voice rough. "You sure you want to stay the night?" I smiled, hoping to brush off his concern. "I've camped in worse places, just here to study the rocks." His expression didn't change. "They say people go missing up here. Strange things happen. You hear whispers at night, you see shadows. Don't follow them." I chuckled nervously. "I'll be fine. Thanks for the warning." He stared at me for a moment longer before walking away. His words hung in the air, but I pushed them aside. I wasn't here for ghost stories. The ridge was breathtaking in the moonlight. I spent hours examining the volcanic rock formations, taking samples and documenting everything with my camera. Strange carvings marked some of the rocks, spirals, runes, and crude figures that looked nothing like the Native American petroglyphs I'd studied before. I took photos, noting that some of the carvings depicted a woman with a hollow face and long, clawed fingers. Local folklore, I assumed. Probably added by hikers or campers looking to spook each other. That night, as I lay in my RV, I heard whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind slipping through the cracks in the ridge. But the longer I listened, the clearer the voices became. A woman's voice, low and rhythmic, chanting in a language I didn't recognize. I sat up, heart pounding, and grabbed my flashlight. Stepping outside, I shone the beam around the clearing. The wind had picked up, rustling the sparse vegetation, but there was no sign of anyone. The whispers stopped. I went back inside, telling myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, I returned to the ridge to continue my work. As I retraced my steps from the night before, I noticed something strange. One of the carvings had changed. The spiral was now deeper, its lines jagged and uneven. I shook my head. "Erosion," I muttered. though the explanation didn't sit right. Later, I discovered my compass wouldn't work near certain rocks. The needle spun wildly, and when I used my phone to take a reading, it glitched out completely. My equipment, usually reliable, started giving nonsensical readings. Magnets pulled in odd directions, and my flashlight flickered even though the batteries were new. That night, the whispers returned. Louder this time, almost inside my RV. "Leave," the voice said, clear as day. I froze, clutching my flashlight. When I looked outside, I saw shadows darting between the rocks, shadows that didn't belong to anything living. The third day brought even more strangeness. The carvings now pointed toward a narrow path I hadn't noticed before. Against my better judgment, I followed it, climbing higher into the ridge. I found more carvings along the way, depicting the hollow-faced woman surrounded by swirling spirals. The path ended at a small clearing with a large stone altar at its center. The air felt heavier here, oppressive and thick, as if the world itself was holding its breath. That night, the witch appeared. I woke to the sound of stones scraping together, like heavy boulders being dragged. When I stepped outside, I saw her, a figure made of shadow and swirling dust, her hollow face glowing faintly in the dark. She was massive, her elongated limbs stretching unnaturally as she pointed toward the ridge. "Come," she whispered, her voice cold and echoing. I stumbled back, barely able to breathe. She didn't move closer, but the shadows around her shifted, forming shapes that resembled human faces, angry, mournful, accusing. The next day I found signs that others had been here before me. Scattered belongings half buried in the dirt. Backpacks, boots, even a shattered phone. My blood ran cold. These weren't ancient artifacts, they were recent. I should have left then. I should have packed up my RV and driven away. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to see this through. That night, the witch returned, more vivid and terrifying than before. She circled my RV, her whispers growing louder and more urgent. Shadows pressed against the windows, their forms stretching and twisting unnaturally. When I stepped outside, she led me back to the altar. The spirals around it glowed faintly, and the ground vibrated beneath my feet. "You've come too far," her voice said inside my head, though her mouth never moved. I tried to flee, but the spirals on the ground formed a barrier, trapping me in a circle of glowing runes. The witch loomed over me, her shadowy form blotting out the stars. The faces in the shadows screamed silently, their mouths wide with anguish. Desperate, I grabbed the hammer from my belt and struck the altar. The stone cracked with a deafening sound and the glowing spirals flickered. The witch screamed, her form flickering and distorting. The shadows collapsed around her and the air seemed to explode outward, knocking me off my feet. I don't remember getting back to my RV, but I woke at dawn, bruised and trembling. The ridge was silent, the oppressive atmosphere gone. My RV started without issue and I drove away as fast as I could. When I reviewed my photos later, every image of the carvings was blurred or corrupted. The samples I'd collected had turned to dust. I wrote about Mescalero Ridge on my blog, leaving out the supernatural details. I wanted to warn others, but I knew no one would believe the truth. Weeks later, I found a spiral rune scratched into the side of my RV. I don't think she's done with me. My name is Ethan Parker. I was 28 years old when it happened, but it feels like a lifetime ago. I've told my story a dozen times and no one ever believes me. Maybe you won't either, but on that night in the Sandia Mountains, I saw something that no amount of logic can explain. It cost me my best friend and any sense of peace I had left. This happened in October 2023 on the La Luz Trail. Jack and I planned it as a challenge, just the two of us. He was my best friend, the confident one, the leader. Me? I was the cautious guy, the one who double-checked the weather and packed extra gear. Jack called it overthinking. He was the risk-taker. I was the safety net. We balanced each other out, or at least we used to. We started early, parking the RV at the trailhead under a sky smeared with orange and purple. Jack was pumped, slapping my shoulder as we strapped on our gear. "Come on, Ethan," he grinned. "This is going to be epic." I nodded, trying to match his enthusiasm, but something felt off. The air was too still, the way it gets before a storm. I checked the weather again on my phone. No signal. The first few miles were easy. Jack kept a fast pace, cracking jokes and pointing out random birds. I was slower, taking in the scenery. Dense forests, jagged rocks, and the occasional burst of wildflowers. The trail was quiet, almost unnaturally so. About 2 hours in, we hit our first snag. The zipper on my sleeping bag jammed, completely useless. I cursed under my breath. "Relax," Jack said, shrugging it off. "We'll figure it out." "Yeah, but if it gets cold." "It won't," he cut me off, flashing his trademark grin. "Stop worrying." By mid-afternoon, the sky had darkened. The sun was still up there somewhere, but thick clouds swallowed its light. That's when I noticed the trees. Deep claw marks etched into the bark, as if something massive had been sharpening its nails. "Hey, Jack, look at this," I said. He glanced at the marks and laughed. "Mountain lion, probably." "That big?" I pressed. "Nature's full of surprises, buddy." He moved on, leaving me staring at the scratches. Then came the whispers. Faint, like the rustle of leaves, but with a rhythm. Almost like voices. "You hear that?" I asked. Jack paused, cocking his head. "Wind. You're spooking yourself." I wanted to believe him, but the sound seemed to follow us, always just out of earshot. By late afternoon, the air turned icy. A light snow began to fall, unusual for October. Jack cursed under his breath as the flakes thickened, visibility dropping fast. "We need to find shelter," he said, finally sounding serious. Luck, or something else, led us to a cave. It was shallow, but deep enough to shield us from the snowstorm. Inside, the walls were lined with crude carvings, humanoid figures with twisted limbs and elongated faces. "This place is creepy as hell," I muttered. Jack grinned. "Adds to the adventure, right?" We set up camp, eating in uneasy silence as the wind howled outside. The storm grew fiercer, snow piling up at the cave's entrance. That night, the growls started. Low, guttural, and inhuman. They echoed from deeper within the cave, growing louder and closer. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Jack was already up, flashlight in hand. "Probably an animal. Stay here." "Jack, wait." He didn't listen, disappearing into the darkness. I sat there, every nerve on edge, the growls reverberating through the cave. Then came a scream. Jack's scream, followed by silence. He staggered back moments later, pale and shaking. "We need to leave, now." "What did you see?" "Just grab your stuff." As we packed in a frenzy, the growls returned, this time closer. The flashlight flickered, and in its weak beam I saw it. The creature was grotesque, tall and emaciated, with antler-like protrusions and glowing, malevolent eyes. Its mouth stretched into a grin, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth. It spoke, but not in its voice. It used Jack's voice. "Ethan, come closer." I froze, terror rooting me in place. Jack grabbed my arm, yanking me toward the entrance. "Run!" he yelled. We bolted into the storm, the creature chasing us. Its speed was unnatural, its limbs bending in ways that defied logic. I stumbled, snow blinding me, but Jack pulled me up, shouting encouragement I could barely hear over the wind. The cave was far behind us, but the Wendigo was relentless. Jack stopped suddenly, turning to face the creature. "Keep going, Ethan," he said, his voice steady but his eyes wild. "What? No." "Go!" he shouted, shoving me forward. I hesitated for a heartbeat before running, tears freezing on my cheeks. Behind me, I heard Jack's screams, then silence. I made it back to the RV at dawn, frostbitten and delirious. I told the authorities everything, but no one believed me. No trace of Jack or the creature was ever found. Now, when the wind howls, I hear whispers in his voice. "Ethan, come back." I won't. Not ever. My name is Ellie Harper, and I was 32 years old when it happened. I'd always prided myself on being independent, the kind of person who could pack up and go anywhere without a second thought. My job as a travel writer demanded it, and I loved the thrill of being alone in the wilderness. But what happened in the Bisti/Dina Zin wilderness in October 2023 still haunts me. Some nights, I wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, as if I'm back there. I don't know if I'll ever return to that place. Maybe sharing this story will help me make sense of it, or maybe it'll just sound like another ghost tale. Either way, here it is. I arrived at the Bisti wilderness late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows over the jagged rock formations. The place looked like something out of a dream, or a nightmare. Towering hoodoos and petrified logs stretched across a barren landscape, their shapes twisted by centuries of wind and time. I parked my RV at the edge of the wilderness, far from any main roads or other campers. That was the point, after all. Solitude. I needed inspiration for my next article, and Bisti, with its eerie beauty, seemed perfect. The first day passed uneventfully. I spent hours exploring, snapping photos and jotting notes in my journal. When the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the rocks in deep oranges and purples, I felt a strange mix of awe and unease. The silence was oppressive. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own breathing and the occasional crunch of gravel underfoot. It wasn't scary, not yet. It was just strange. That night, the wind picked up, howling around the RV like an angry spirit. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But then I heard it. Whispers. They were faint at first, barely audible over the wind, but they grew louder, more insistent. "Ellie! Ellie!" I shot up, my heart pounding. Who the hell was out there? I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, shining the beam into the darkness. Nothing. Just the wind and the eerie landscape. Shaking, I locked the door and crawled back into bed, telling myself it was just a trick of the wind. The next morning, I felt foolish for being so spooked. The sun was shining, the strange hoodoos casting long, distorted shadows, and I was ready to explore more of the wilderness. I hiked deeper into the formations, marveling at the bizarre shapes and taking more photos. That's when I saw them. Symbols carved into the rocks. They weren't like the ancient petroglyphs I'd seen before. These were sharper, more precise, as if they'd been etched recently. A chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off. Maybe another hiker had done it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, the whispers returned. They were louder this time, more distinct, as if they were right outside the RV. "Ellie, let me in." I froze. The voice was my own. I clutched my flashlight, my breath coming in short gasps. I peeked through the window and saw a shadow moving between the rocks. My heart hammered as I watched it dart closer, its movements unnatural, almost jerky. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. "Ellie, let me in," the voice said again, perfectly mimicking mine. I screamed, grabbing a knife from the counter. But when I looked out the window again, the shadow was gone. By the third day, I was rattled but determined to get to the bottom of whatever was happening. I hiked further into the wilderness, carrying only the essentials. My camera started glitching, distorting the images I took. One photo showed a shadowy figure in the distance that hadn't been there when I snapped the picture. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a coyote, thin, with matted fur and glowing yellow eyes. But as it approached, its body began to change. Its limbs lengthened, its back straightened, and its face morphed into something almost human. The creature stood on two legs, staring at me with a twisted grin. "Ellie," it said in my voice. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my camera. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. The creature took a step closer. "You shouldn't have come here." I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get away, but the wilderness had a way of turning you around. I ended up at an abandoned campsite, the remnants of a fire pit surrounded by scattered belongings. Among the debris was a journal. The pages were water damaged, but I could make out enough to piece together the story. The writer had been a solo camper, just like me. They'd heard the whispers, seen the shadows, and been hunted by the same creature. The final entry read, "It wants your voice. Don't let it take you." I barely had time to process the words before I heard it again, my voice, calling from the rocks. The creature was back, circling me like a predator sizing up its prey. I grabbed a flare from my pack and lit it, holding it out like a torch. The creature hissed, recoiling from the bright light. "You can't have me," I shouted, waving the flare. It lunged, but I threw the flare at its feet, the flames licking at its twisted body. It screamed, a guttural, ear-piercing sound, and retreated into the shadows. I didn't wait to see if it would return. I sprinted back toward the RV, my lungs burning and my legs shaking. When I reached the RV, I locked myself inside and drove away as fast as I could. The landscape blurred past me, but I didn't care. I just needed to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. I never finished the article. The photos, distorted and nightmarish, were too horrifying to share. And even now, miles away from the Bisty wilderness, I still hear the whispers in my dreams. "Ellie, let me in." My name is Tom Grayson. I was 45 years old when it happened, though sometimes it feels like I've aged decades since then. I was a retired Marine, living out of my RV and bouncing from one lonely stretch of wilderness to another. Isolation was my comfort, my shield. After 3 tours overseas and a lifetime of regret, I couldn't stomach people anymore. Not their small talk, not their judgmental stares, and certainly not their pity. This happened in the Jornada del Muerto Desert in New Mexico. The name means Journey of the Dead, which I probably should have taken as a warning. I told myself I was drawn there by the quiet, the challenge of surviving 2 weeks in one of the harshest places I could find. But deep down, I think I went looking for punishment. I rolled my RV into the desert under a blistering afternoon sun, dust trailing behind me like a shadow. The ghost town came into view just as the light began to soften. A cluster of crumbling adobe buildings, sun-bleached and abandoned. The place had a weight to it, like the earth itself was holding its breath. I parked at the edge of the ruins, where an old wooden sign leaned crookedly in the sand. Faded letters spelled out San Alejandro. I grabbed my pack, checked my knife, compass, and canteen, and stepped out into the sweltering heat. The silence hit me like a punch to the gut. No birds, no wind, nothing. The first couple of days were uneventful. I spent my time exploring the ruins, documenting them in a leather notebook I kept. The old church caught my attention early on. A hollowed-out shell with charred beams and a cracked bell lying half buried in the dirt. Inside, I found an altar blackened by fire and covered in strange, looping symbols. They didn't look like any Spanish or Native American writing I'd seen before. That night, as I lay in my RV, the wind picked up. It wasn't a steady gust, like you'd expect in the desert. It came in fits and starts, like something breathing outside my door. I told myself it was just the weather, but I slept with my knife under my pillow anyway. The second night, I started hearing voices. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. The voices were faint, carried on the wind, speaking in a language I didn't understand. I stepped out of the RV with my flashlight, scanning the ruins. The beam of light caught movement. A shadow slipping behind a crumbled wall. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sharp and steady. No answer. Just the wind. By the time I crawled back into bed, the whispers had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The third day, things escalated. My compass went haywire, spinning in endless circles. My watch stopped working, and my GPS flickered before dying completely. The desert seemed to close in around me, the horizon blurring in the heat. It felt like the world was shifting, twisting itself into something I didn't recognize. That afternoon, while exploring the ruins again, I saw the shadow. This time, it didn't run. It stood at the edge of the church, tall and thin, its outline shimmering like a mirage. I called out to it, my hand instinctively going to my knife. The shadow didn't move. As I approached, it dissolved into the wind. That night, the wind howled like a living thing, slamming against the RV and rattling the windows. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling when I heard the voice. Deep and guttural, it spoke my name. "Tom!" I shot out of bed, heart pounding. The air inside the RV had gone ice cold. I grabbed my knife and opened the door, stepping into the howling darkness. The wind hit me like a wall, nearly knocking me off my feet. And then I saw it, the figure from earlier, now fully formed. It was massive, its body shrouded in shadow, but its eyes glowing like embers. Its face was twisted, more animal than human, and its claws dragged in the sand as it moved toward me. "You cannot run from yourself," it said, its voice like grinding stone. I stumbled backward, the knife shaking in my hand. "What do you want?" I shouted, though I wasn't sure I wanted an answer. The creature laughed, a sound that made my skin crawl. "I am the wind, I am fire, I am the weight you carry, and I will devour you." It lunged, and I barely had time to react, throwing myself to the ground as its claws slashed through the air. I scrambled back into the RV, slamming the door behind me. The wind roared, slamming into the vehicle with such force that it felt like the whole thing might flip. I grabbed a flare from my emergency kit, lighting it and hurling it out the door. The flames illuminated the creature's face, long and hollow, its features stretching like smoke. It recoiled from the light, hissing like a snake. I barricaded myself inside, clutching the knife like it was a lifeline. The whispers returned, louder now, and they weren't just voices anymore. They were memories, moments from my past I'd buried deep, the cries of civilians caught in crossfire, the faces of my comrades who didn't make it home, the voice of a man I'd killed, begging for his life. The creature's voice broke through. "You came here because you wanted to suffer. Let me take it from you. Let me take you." "No," I shouted, though part of me wanted to give in. The guilt was too heavy, too consuming. But something inside me, some shred of the man I used to be, refused. The wind intensified, shaking the RV so violently I thought it might tear apart. I knew I couldn't stay inside. Grabbing a second flare and a can of fuel, I stepped out into the storm. The creature loomed before me, its fiery eyes locking onto mine. "You cannot escape," it said. "I'm not running," I replied. I lit the flare and hurled it at the ground, igniting a ring of fire around me. The creature howled, recoiling from the flames. I held my ground, the heat licking at my skin, and stared into its burning eyes. "You're not real," I said, the words more for me than for it. "You're just a part of me, and I'm done letting you control me." The creature screamed, a sound that shook the very ground, and then it was gone, dissolved into the wind. The desert was silent again, the fire burning itself out as I stood there, shaking but alive. The wind was gone, the shadows with it. I packed up my RV the next morning, leaving the Jornada del Muerto behind. I still hear the whispers sometimes in the dead of night, but they're quieter now, and I don't run from them anymore, because I know the real monster was never out there. It was always inside me. My name is Amy Miller, and I'm 30 years old. This happened last summer, during a camping trip to a place called Blood Mesa in New Mexico. At the time, I thought it would be a simple weekend getaway, an opportunity to face some personal demons and spend time with people I cared about. But by the end of that trip, I wasn't the same person. None of us were. Derek, my boyfriend, was the one who suggested Blood Mesa. He's a filmmaker, a self-proclaimed explorer of the paranormal, and had heard about strange occurrences there from a local Navajo guide. According to the guide, the mesa was cursed, tainted by ancient spirits. People had vanished there, their bodies never found. Derek, of course, was thrilled. "This will be perfect for the doc," he said, already packing his camera gear as I sat on the couch, skeptical. "Perfect for getting us lost," Kayla, my best friend, had muttered. She wasn't thrilled about the trip either, but she agreed to come. Partly for me, partly because she wanted to keep Derek in check. Their relationship was complicated. By the time we set off, the tension between them was palpable. I tried to stay optimistic, though. I needed this trip. After losing my younger brother in a car accident 5 years ago, I'd been stuck in a cycle of guilt and fear. Camping on the mesa felt like a chance to prove to myself that I could move forward. We arrived at Blood Mesa in the late afternoon. The sun was a fiery orb sinking into the jagged horizon, casting long shadows across the red rock formations. The landscape was beautiful but desolate, and the stillness unnerved me. We parked the SUV at the trailhead and unloaded our gear. Derek was giddy, filming every rock and shrub as we hiked up to the plateau. Kayla stayed quiet, occasionally muttering about how heavy her pack was or how Derek needed to focus on getting to camp before dark. By the time we reached the top of the mesa, the wind had picked up, howling through the canyons like a warning. We set up our tents in a sheltered spot near the edge of the plateau. The view was breathtaking. Miles of wilderness stretching out below us, painted in shades of gold and crimson by the setting sun. "Not bad, huh?" Derek said, setting up his tripod. He was like a kid in a candy store, completely oblivious to the unease that had settled over Kayla and me. "It's fine," Kayla said, sitting down with a sigh, "as long as nothing eats us tonight." The first sign that something was wrong came just after dinner. As we sat around the campfire roasting marshmallows and telling stupid jokes to lighten the mood, I noticed movement at the edge of the firelight. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice low. "See what?" Derek turned, his camera already in hand. "There." I pointed toward the shadows, but the movement was gone. Probably just an animal, I said, trying to convince myself as much as them. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural growl, too deep to belong to a coyote. Kayla froze, her marshmallow stick halfway to her mouth. "Mountain lion?" she whispered. "No way," Derek said, adjusting his camera. "Mountain lions don't growl like that." It sounded off. The growl came again, closer this time. Derek stood, his camera pointed toward the darkness. I grabbed his arm. "Stop," I said, my voice trembling. "Don't go out there." He hesitated, but stayed put, and after a few minutes the growling stopped. Still, the sense of being watched lingered. Things escalated the next day. We set out early to explore the mesa, but our equipment started failing almost immediately. My GPS stopped working, the screen flickering before going blank. Derek's camera batteries drained faster than normal, and Kayla's compass spun wildly, pointing nowhere. "Great," Kayla said, tossing the compass back into her pack. "Now what?" "We keep going," Derek said, undeterred. "We're close to the spot the guide mentioned." "Of course we are," Kayla muttered, rolling her eyes. "Lead the way, genius." I tried to keep the peace, but my unease grew with every step. The trails were narrow, the drop-offs sheer. A single misstep could have sent us plummeting into the canyon below. And then there was the coyote. We saw it again around noon, perched on a rock outcropping, watching us with unblinking eyes. It didn't move, didn't flinch, even when Derek threw a rock to scare it off. "That's not normal," Kayla said, her voice low. "No," I agreed, my stomach twisting. "It's not." That night, the real horror began. We were sitting around the campfire again, trying to shake off the day's tension, when we heard it. A voice, faint and distant, calling my name. "Amy," it whispered, carried on the wind. I froze, the hairs on my neck standing on end. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" Derek said, looking up from his camera. "It said my name," I whispered. Kayla's face paled. "I heard it too." The voice came again, louder this time. "Amy, help me." It sounded like my brother. "No," I said, shaking my head. "No, it's not him. It can't be." But the voice was so familiar, so heartbreakingly real that I stood without thinking. "Amy, don't," Kayla said, grabbing my arm. "It's trying to trick you," Derek added. I hesitated, my heart pounding. The voice called again, pleading, and I nearly stepped into the darkness before reason took hold. I backed away, trembling, and Derek doused the fire to keep us hidden. Sleep was impossible. I lay in my tent, clutching my flashlight, listening to the whispers outside. They weren't just calling my name anymore. They were mimicking all of us. My voice, Kayla's voice, Derek's. Around midnight, I heard footsteps circling the camp. Slow, deliberate. The coyote growled, low and menacing, and I swore I saw its shadow moving between the tents, larger than it had any right to be. When morning came, we were all shaken but alive. Derek suggested leaving, but I knew the mesa wouldn't let us go so easily. "We have to do something," I said. "Like what?" Kayla asked, her voice tight with fear. I thought of my grandmother, a Navajo woman who had once told me stories of skinwalkers, shapeshifters that fed on fear and chaos. She had said they could be repelled with fire and sage, but we were running low on both. "Trust me," I said, grabbing the sage we had left. That night, we built the largest fire we could and burned the sage, chanting words my grandmother had taught me. The air grew heavy, and the whispers turned into shrieks. The coyote appeared again, standing at the edge of the firelight, its eyes glowing with unnatural light. It stepped closer, its form shifting. half human, half beast. Its voice was a grotesque mimicry of my brother's. "You can't save him," it said, its grin wide and malicious. Something inside me snapped. I grabbed a burning branch from the fire and stepped forward, swinging it at the creature. It recoiled, its human-like scream piercing the night. "Leave us!" I shouted, my voice breaking. The creature hesitated, its form flickering before retreating into the shadows. The air grew still, and the whispers faded. We left Blood Mesa at first light, our nerves shattered, but our bodies intact. Derek never finished his documentary, and Kayla refuses to talk about what happened. As for me, I try to move on, but the memories linger. Sometimes in the dead of night I hear whispers outside my window, faint, familiar, and utterly wrong. My name is Tom Harris, and I'm 42 years old. This happened just a few months ago in the dense woods of Lincoln National Forest, New Mexico. I took my RV out there to escape life for a while. Divorce has a way of making you feel like you're drowning, and I thought being alone in the wilderness would give me the clarity I needed to start over. Instead, I found something else. Something that still keeps me awake at night. I arrived at the forest just before dusk, the sun casting golden rays through the trees as I parked my RV near a well-worn campsite. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of pine and moss. This was exactly what I needed, a week of solitude surrounded by nature. I had everything, food, water, and enough survival gear to keep me comfortable. The first night was uneventful. I built a small fire, cooked some canned chili, and watched the stars. The silence was profound, a sharp contrast to the chaos of city life. I slept well, feeling the kind of peace I hadn't known in years. The next morning, I met a woman named Jess. She was a hiker, probably in her late 20s, with a golden retriever named Max bounding around her feet. "You here alone?" she asked, her tone more curious than concerned. "Yeah," I said. "Just needed a break from everything." She nodded knowingly. "Same here, just me and Max. Be careful, though. This forest can mess with your head if you're not careful." She gave me a small wave and disappeared down a nearby trail, leaving me to wonder what she meant. Later that day, I met another local, an older man named George. He lived in a rundown cabin not far from my campsite and had the kind of weathered face that told you he'd seen things most people couldn't imagine. "You're camping here?" he asked, eyeing my RV with a mixture of amusement and pity. "For a week," I said. He chuckled, shaking his head. "If I were you, I'd steer clear of the hollow trail. A lot of folks have gone missing there. Locals say it's cursed." I raised an eyebrow. "Cursed?" George's face darkened. "They call it the Watcher, some kind of spirit or something worse. Likes to lure people in, make them disappear." I tried not to laugh. "Thanks for the warning." "Suit yourself," he said, his voice grave, "but don't say I didn't warn you." That evening, I stumbled upon the trail George had mentioned. The sign was barely visible, its paint chipped and faded. "Hollow Trail, do not enter." I stared at it for a long moment. The rational part of me said to leave it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I stepped onto the path just to see where it led. At first, it was just another trail, narrow, overgrown, with the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. But the further I went, the stranger things became. The temperature dropped suddenly, a chill that seeped into my bones. The wind picked up, whispering through the trees like distant voices. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination, but the unease was impossible to shake. By the time I turned back, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the shadows stretched long and dark. I made it back to my RV just as night fell, but sleep didn't come easily. The next few days were a blur of mounting strangeness. One night, as I sat by the fire, I heard a woman's voice in the distance. "Help me," she called, faint and desperate. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the darkness, but there was nothing. The voice came again, closer this time. "Please, help me." It sounded like Jess. "Jess!" I called out, my heart racing. "Is that you?" No answer. Just the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. I stood frozen, every instinct screaming at me to stay put. The fire crackled behind me, its warmth doing little to chase away the cold dread creeping over me. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl. I turned slowly, and there it was, a coyote, perched on a rock just beyond the firelight. Its eyes glowed green, impossibly bright, and it stared at me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. I threw a rock, trying to scare it off, but it didn't move. It just watched. The next morning, Jess and Max were gone. Her campsite was empty, as if she'd never been there. "Jess," I called out, wandering through the woods, "are you out here?" No response. I found one thing, though. A tattered piece of fabric caught on a branch, the same scarf Jess had been wearing the day we met. That evening, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound felt too deliberate. When night fell, I locked myself in the RV, but even that didn't feel safe. The whispers started again, faint but insistent. They sounded like Jess, like George, even like my ex-wife. "Tom," they called, "come to us." I covered my ears trying to block them out, but the voices only grew louder. I decided to leave the next morning, but the forest had other plans. The road I'd taken in was gone, replaced by dense trees that seemed to have grown overnight. My GPS was useless, the screen flickering before going black. Panicked, I grabbed my survival gear and headed back toward the hollow trail, hoping it might lead me out. The deeper I went, the more surreal the forest became. Trees twisted unnaturally, their branches forming shapes that looked almost human. I saw flickers of movement in the corners of my eyes, shadows darting between the trees. Then I saw her. "Jess?" She was standing in the middle of the trail, her back to me. "Jess! Thank God! I've been looking for you." She didn't respond. I stepped closer, reaching out to touch her shoulder. When she turned, her face wasn't hers. It was wrong, twisted, her eyes glowing the same sickly green as the coyote's. I stumbled back, tripping over a root, and when I looked up, she was gone. By the time night fell, I was completely lost. The Watcher revealed itself then, stepping out from the shadows like it had been waiting for me. It was tall, impossibly so, its body shifting between solid and shadow. Its glowing green eyes bore into me. And when it spoke, its voice was a distorted echo of my own. "You can't leave," it said. I lit a torch with the last of my fire starter, holding it out in front of me like a shield. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice shaking. The Watcher laughed, a sound that rattled through the trees. "You're already mine." It lunged, but I swung the torch, the flames driving it back. It howled, a sound that was both human and animal, before retreating into the darkness. I don't remember much about how I got out. One moment I was on the trail, and the next I was stumbling into the parking lot where my RV was parked. I didn't waste time. I jumped in, started the engine, and drove until the forest was a distant memory. When I stopped to refuel hours later, I noticed claw marks down the side of the RV. Long, deep gouges that hadn't been there before. I don't camp anymore, I don't go near forests. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers again. "Tom," they call, "come back." My name is Claire Wilson, and I'm 36 years old. This happened just a few weeks ago. while I was working on a story in the Bisti/Danazin wilderness in New Mexico. I'm a travel writer, the kind of person who thrives on digging into eerie legends and forgotten histories. But what I experienced out there wasn't just some story. It changed me, haunted me in ways I still can't fully explain. The trip was supposed to be simple. Research the local legend of a witch who had been hanged by her village in the late 1800s, spend a couple of days photographing the Badlands, and head home to Albuquerque to write my article. Easy enough, right? The Bisti Badlands were stunning. Hoodoos stretched toward the sky like jagged fingers, their alien shapes casting long shadows in the golden light. I parked my RV near a trailhead, eager to start exploring. The wilderness was eerily silent. No birds, no wind, just a stillness that felt unnatural. At the visitor center, I met Isaac, a Navajo guide. He seemed kind, but his eyes lingered on me as though he knew something I didn't. "You're here about the legend?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded. "The witch, supposedly buried out here, right?" Isaac hesitated. "She's not buried, she's bound. Don't disturb the site." Before I could press him for details, he walked away, his expression grim. His warning stayed with me, but curiosity has always been my fatal flaw. That evening, I set out to find the grave. The trail was faint, barely visible in the shifting sands. I walked for hours, my camera swinging at my side, until I stumbled upon a circle of stones at the base of a towering hoodoo. Inside the circle were symbols carved into the rock, intricate designs that seemed older than anything I'd ever seen. In the center, a weathered pile of bones jutted from the ground, half buried by time. This had to be it. I crouched to examine the symbols, running my fingers over their rough edges. They were beautiful, hypnotic, and they seemed to hum faintly under my touch. A small, round carving caught my eye. A stone etched with a spiral no bigger than my palm. It felt wrong to take it, but I did anyway. By the time I made it back to my RV, the sun was setting. The Badlands turned blood red under the fading light, and the silence pressed against my ears like a living thing. I climbed into the RV and locked the door, the carving tucked safely into my bag. That night, the wind started. It came out of nowhere, shaking the RV and howling like a wounded animal. I sat up in bed, clutching the blanket around me as shadows danced across the windows. At first, I thought it was just the storm playing tricks on me. But then I heard it, a whisper. "Claire." It was faint, almost drowned out by the wind, but unmistakable. I froze, my heart pounding. "Hello?" No answer. Just the whisper again, closer this time. "Claire, come back." The next day, I tried to brush it off. Sleep deprivation, I told myself. Too many ghost stories rattling around in my brain. But as I ventured back into the Badlands to take more photos, the unease grew. The trail seemed different, twisting in ways I didn't remember. Shapes moved in the corners of my vision, shadows that disappeared when I turned my head. At one point, I spotted a scarecrow-like figure tied to a hoodoo in the distance. Its silhouette was stark against the pale sky, arms stretched wide as if in warning. When I got closer, it was gone. That evening, I met Paul and Maggie, a cheerful couple camping near the trailhead. They invited me to join their campfire, and I was grateful for the company. "You shouldn't stay out there after dark," Paul said as we roasted marshmallows. "Why not?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Maggie glanced at him, then back at me. "They say the witch still walks the Badlands. They hanged her, but her spirit never left. It's worse during the witching hour." I laughed nervously. "And when's that?" "Midnight," Paul said, his tone deadly serious. I didn't tell them about the carving. I didn't tell them about the whispers or the shadows. I thanked them for the s'mores and retreated to my RV, locking the doors and curtains behind me. At 11:58, the wind started again. This time, it wasn't just howling. It carried voices, dozens of them, overlapping in a chorus of anguish and anger. I tried to drown it out, plugging my ears and humming to myself, but the voices grew louder, pressing against my mind like claws. When the clock struck midnight, everything stopped. The wind, the voices. The silence was absolute. Then the scratching started. It came from the roof of the RV, slow and deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight and flung open the door, shining the beam into the darkness. Nothing. Just the empty desert and the faint glow of the moon. But when I turned back, claw marks raked across the RV's windshield, deep and jagged. I decided to leave the next morning. I packed my things in record time, started the engine, and drove toward the main road. Or at least I tried to. The road was gone. In its place was an endless expanse of hoodoos and cracked earth, stretching in every direction. My GPS flickered uselessly, the map spinning like a compass gone mad. Panic set in. I slammed on the brakes and stumbled out of the RV, clutching the carving like a lifeline. "Isaac!" I shouted, as if the guide could somehow hear me. "What do I do?" The answer came not from him, but from the land itself. The shadows shifted, coalescing into a figure at the edge of my vision. She was tall and gaunt, her skeletal hands curled into claws. A noose dangled from her neck, swaying as though caught in a breeze that didn't exist. Her eyes locked onto mine, and a voice echoed in my head. "You disturbed my grave." I stumbled back, my heart hammering. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "Return what you've taken," she hissed, her voice dripping with malice. I ran, clutching the carving as the witch pursued me. The Badlands twisted around me, the trail folding in on itself like a living maze. The air grew colder, and the shadows deepened until it felt like I was running through a nightmare. Finally, I reached the grave. The symbols carved into the rock glowed faintly, pulsating like a heartbeat. I placed the carving in the center of the circle, whispering an apology as tears streamed down my face. The wind roared, and the witch's scream pierced the air. I dropped to my knees, covering my ears as the sound grew unbearable. Then, silence. I opened my eyes. The grave was undisturbed, the symbols dark. The witch was gone. When I returned to my RV, the road had reappeared. The claw marks on the windshield were gone, but the memory of them and of her remains. I still have nightmares. Sometimes I wake to the sound of whispers. Claire, I don't look back. My name is Elena Rivera, and I'm 34 years old. This happened in May of last year, during what should have been a peaceful RV trip to White Sands National Park in New Mexico. I wanted to capture the surreal beauty of the dunes for a photography exhibit. What I found instead still haunts my dreams. It started innocently enough. My fiancé, Marcus Ramirez, and I parked our RV on the outskirts of the park. It was a perfect spot, secluded, with an uninterrupted view of the endless white dunes. Marcus, ever the practical one, teased me as I unpacked my camera gear. "You're going to run out of memory cards before we even step out," he said, shaking his head. He was 37, a journalist who thrived on facts and logic, and my polar opposite when it came to the unknown. "That's the point," I replied, grinning. "These dunes are magic, Marcus. Wait till you see them under the moonlight." The first night passed uneventfully. We cooked dinner, watched the sunset paint the dunes gold and pink, and settled into the RV as the desert grew cold. It wasn't until the second night that things began to feel off. It started with the wind. Desert winds are common, but this one carried whispers. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the breeze brushing past the RV's windows. But as I stepped outside to photograph the moonlit dunes, the whispers grew louder, like 100 voices murmuring just out of earshot. "Do you hear that?" I asked Marcus when I came back inside. "Hear what?" he replied, looking up from his laptop. "The wind. It sounds like people talking." Marcus chuckled. "It's just the way the wind moves over the sand. Nothing spooky, Elena." I nodded, but a prickle of unease had already taken root. The next day, we hiked into the dunes. The landscape was mesmerizing, an alien world of pristine white ripples that seemed to stretch forever. I was snapping photos when I noticed something strange. "Marcus, come look at this," I called. In the untouched expanse of sand were small, barefoot prints. They were too small to belong to an adult, and they stopped abruptly as though the person had vanished into thin air. "Maybe it's from some kid who was here earlier," Marcus said, frowning. "But there aren't any other footprints around," I pointed out. He shrugged, brushing it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching us. That night, the whispers returned. This time, they were clearer, almost like voices calling out. "Help me," one of them seemed to say. I shot upright in bed, my heart pounding. "Marcus, did you hear that?" He groaned. "Elena, it's the wind. Go back to sleep." I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, every nerve in my body taut. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, a child's voice, faint but unmistakable. "Help me!" I grabbed my camera and stepped outside, scanning the dunes with my flashlight. There was nothing but the soft hiss of the wind and the eerie glow of the moon on the sand. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the fourth night, Marcus was finally starting to believe me. The whispers had grown louder, and he could hear them too. "Stay with us, don't leave," they seemed to plead. We decided to cut our trip short, but as Marcus tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. "Great," he muttered, slamming the dashboard. "What now?" Before I could respond, a light appeared on the dunes. A dim, flickering glow that moved erratically, as if carried by an invisible hand. "What the hell is that?" Marcus whispered. I didn't answer. I was too mesmerized and terrified to speak. The light grew closer, and then I saw them. Figures of children, pale and translucent, their hollow eyes fixed on us. "Stay inside," Marcus said, his voice low and urgent. But I couldn't. I stepped out, my camera in hand, as if capturing their image could make sense of what I was seeing. One of the figures stepped forward, a girl no older than 7. She reached out a hand, her voice echoing in my mind. "Stay with us. We're lost." "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. "To be found," she replied. Behind me, Marcus was yelling, trying to pull me back inside, but I couldn't move. It was as if her words had rooted me to the spot. The spirits surrounded the RV, their voices rising in a haunting chorus. Marcus grabbed my arm, breaking whatever spell I was under, and dragged me inside. "We need to get out of here," he said, pacing. "The engine won't start," I reminded him, panic creeping into my voice. "Then we wait until morning," he said grimly, locking the doors. But the spirits didn't wait. They tapped on the windows, their faces pressed against the glass. One of them left a handprint on the fogged window, on the inside. Desperate, I remembered a story I'd read about lighting a fire to guide lost spirits. "Marcus, we need to light a fire," I said. He looked at me like I was crazy, but helped me gather wood from our supplies. We lit the fire outside the RV, and for a moment, the whispers stopped. The spirits gathered around the flames, their hollow eyes reflecting the light. "Go home," I said softly. "You don't belong here anymore." For a moment, they seemed to waver, their forms flickering like candle flames. But then their faces twisted in anger. "No! You stay with us!" the girl screamed, and the fire went out. In the darkness, the spirits attacked. They pulled at the RV, shaking it violently. Marcus fired a flare gun, the bright light scattering them momentarily. "Get in the driver's seat," I yelled. "What's the point? The engine's dead," he shouted back. "Just do it." Marcus turned the key, and to our disbelief, the engine roared to life. We sped out of the park, the spirits chasing us until we crossed the boundary. We didn't speak for a long time after that. Back home, I developed the photos I'd taken during the trip. Most of them were normal, but one made my blood run cold. It showed me standing among the children, my eyes glowing like theirs. I've never gone back to White Sands, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear their whispers. They're still calling for me, asking me to come back. And sometimes, I think I just might. My name is Harper Lane, and I'm 29 years old. This happened last October when I parked my RV near the Rio Grande Gorge in New Mexico. I was supposed to spend a quiet week writing, trying to break through the creative block that had been gnawing at me for months. Instead, I barely made it out alive. The gorge stretched out before me, a gaping wound in the earth, its jagged cliffs plunging down to the river below. It was breathtaking and terrifying at the same time, a perfect metaphor for how I felt inside, on the edge of something beautiful and disastrous. I parked my RV at a remote overlook, far from the noise of other campers. The silence here was pure, the kind of quiet that settles deep into your chest. I thought it would inspire me. I thought wrong. The first 2 days were uneventful. I spent my mornings hiking the trails, my afternoons staring at a blank notebook, and my evenings sipping tea under a sky littered with stars. It wasn't until the third day that things began to change. It started with the wind. The weather report had called for calm skies, but by late afternoon a storm rolled in. Thick clouds swallowed the sun, and the wind howled through the gorge like a living thing. I stood at the edge of the overlook, watching the storm build, when I thought I heard my name. "Harper." The voice was faint, carried on the wind. I shook my head and laughed nervously. "You're losing it," I muttered to myself. But the wind answered with a low, mocking chuckle that sent a shiver down my spine. That night, the power in the RV went out. No lights, no heat, no charging my phone. I rummaged through the drawers for a flashlight, the darkness pressing in around me. The wind battered the RV, shaking it like a toy, and the whispers returned. At first, they were indistinct, just a murmur beneath the roar of the storm. But as I lay in bed, clutching my flashlight, they grew louder. "Harper, why do you run?" I bolted upright, my heart hammering. The voice was inside the RV. I shone the flashlight around, but the small space was empty. Still, the voice persisted, low and insidious. "You'll never write it. You'll never be enough." I screamed, slamming my hands over my ears. The whispers faded, replaced by the wind's relentless howl. The next morning, I decided to leave. My nerves were shot, and the isolation that had once felt peaceful now felt suffocating. But when I turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered and died. "Come on," I muttered, trying again. Nothing. I stepped outside to check the engine and froze. Scrawled across the RV's dusty windshield were the words, "Stay with me." The letters were smeared, as if written by a finger dragging through dirt. My rational mind fought to explain it away. Maybe it was a prank, I thought. Maybe someone had done it while I was asleep. But I hadn't seen another person in days. Determined to leave, I decided to hike to a nearby ranger station for help. The trail wound along the edge of the gorge. The river far below a distant ribbon of silver. I hadn't gone far when I saw it. A figure standing on the opposite side of the canyon. It was tall and dark, its edges blurred like smoke caught in the wind. It had no face, but its eyes glowed like embers. It didn't move, but I felt its gaze on me, heavy and malevolent. I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing. When I looked again, the figure was gone. That night, the dreams began. In the dream, I was standing at the edge of the gorge, looking down into the abyss. The river below churned, not water, but fire, its flames licking at the canyon walls. A voice echoed from the depths, deep and commanding. "Give me your words, and I'll give you greatness." I woke with a start, my heart pounding. The RV was silent, but the air felt thick, oppressive. I reached for my notebook, desperate to write something, anything, but the pages were blank. I couldn't remember how to begin. By the 5th day, I was unraveling. The whispers were constant now, following me even in the daylight. I found strange symbols carved into the rocks near my campsite. Spirals and claw marks that seemed to pulse with an inner light. That evening, as the sun set in a blood-red sky, the entity appeared again. This time it stood closer, at the edge of the overlook. Its smoky form twisted and shifted, and when it spoke, its voice rumbled like thunder. "You are wasting your gift," it said. "I can free you from your doubts. All I ask is your trust." I wanted to scream at it, to tell it to leave me alone, but the words caught in my throat. Part of me wanted to believe it. Part of me was desperate enough to take its offer. The entity visited me again that night, this time in the RV. Its smoky form seeped through the walls, coalescing into a towering figure with glowing eyes. I pressed myself against the back wall, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "What do you want?" I whispered. "You," it said simply. "Your fear, your soul. In exchange, I will give you all the stories you could ever dream of." Its voice was hypnotic, a dark melody that pulled at the edges of my mind. For a moment, I considered saying yes. But then I thought of the words scrawled on my windshield, the voices that had tormented me. This wasn't inspiration. This was a trap. "No," I said, my voice shaking. "I won't give you anything." The entity roared, its form expanding to fill the RV. I felt its rage like a physical force, pressing me down, stealing the air from my lungs. But just as I thought I would suffocate, it vanished, leaving me gasping in the darkness. I spent the rest of the night huddled in a corner, clutching my notebook like a shield. At dawn, I decided to try the RV one last time. I turned the key, and to my shock, the engine roared to life. I didn't wait to question it. I drove out of the gorge as fast as the RV would take me, the landscape blurring past. When I crossed the park boundary, the whispers stopped, and the oppressive weight lifted from my chest. Back home, I wrote about everything that had happened. The words poured out of me, raw and unfiltered, and for the first time in months, I felt alive. The story became a bestseller, but I couldn't celebrate. Sometimes, when the wind is just right, I hear it again. The low, mocking chuckle that haunted me in the gorge. And I know the devil's breath still waits for me, biding its time. My name is Finn Morrison, and I'm 41 years old. Last October, I drove my RV to Chaco Culture National Historical Park in New Mexico. I went there to chase the stars and escape the mess I'd made of my life. What I found instead was something I can't explain, something I'll never forget. The night sky had always been my refuge. Since I was a kid, staring through a telescope had been my way of escaping reality. After the divorce, I thought this trip would help me find that sense of wonder again. Chaco Canyon, with its remote, dark skies and ancient ruins, seemed like the perfect place. I parked my RV at a site miles away from the main campground. I wanted solitude, a clear view of the heavens without the distraction of other campers. The only sounds were the occasional gust of wind and the distant cries of coyotes. It was perfect. The first 2 nights were uneventful. I set up my telescope, adjusting the lenses and tracking stars. The meteor shower was still a few days away, so I spent my time photographing the Milky Way. The vast silence of the desert wrapped around me like a blanket. But on the 3rd night, the silence changed. I was outside, tinkering with my telescope, when I noticed strange lights in the sky. At first, I thought they were planes, but their movements were wrong. They darted back and forth, stopping abruptly, then shooting off at impossible angles. I watched, transfixed, until they vanished. Satellites, I told myself, though I didn't believe it. The next day, I hiked to a nearby plateau to scope out a new stargazing spot. The canyon was stunning in the daylight, its red cliffs rising like ancient sentinels. As I climbed, I felt a growing unease, as though I was being watched. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. That's when I saw the lights again. This time, they weren't in the sky. They floated just above the ground, small glowing orbs weaving through the rocks and ruins. I stopped in my tracks, watching as they moved closer. They weren't like flashlights or fireflies. These lights had a strange, otherworldly quality, almost like they were alive. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The lights paused, hovering in the air. Then, as if startled, they vanished. That night, I set up my telescope at the new spot. As the stars began to appear, the whispers started. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too human. "Finn." I froze, my hands gripping the telescope. It was faint, but I'd heard it, my name, carried on the breeze. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. The whispers stopped. I scanned the darkness with my flashlight, but there was nothing. Just the desert and the endless night. When I returned to the RV, I found something waiting for me. My notebook, which I'd left on the table, was open. The pages were filled with writing. Words I didn't remember putting there. They were messy, scrawled, as though written in a frenzy. "Follow the lights, they will guide you." I slammed the notebook shut, my pulse racing. This wasn't possible. I was the only one here. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I told myself I was overthinking, letting my imagination run wild. But as the sun set and the desert turned cold, the unease returned. I was hiking back to the RV when the lights appeared again. This time, there were more of them, weaving in and out of the rocks. They moved with purpose, forming a path that led deeper into the canyon. I hesitated. Every logical part of me said to turn around, to leave. But the whispers came again, louder now. "Finn, come with us." Against my better judgment, I followed. The lights led me to an ancient ruin, one I hadn't seen before. It was a crumbling stone structure, barely visible in the moonlight. The air here felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. As I stepped closer, the whispers grew deafening. They weren't just in the air, they were inside my head. "You don't belong there," they said. "Stay with us." I stumbled back, my breath coming in gasps. The lights surrounded me, their glow brightening until it hurt to look at them, and then they changed. The orbs stretched and shifted, transforming into figures, shimmering, humanoid forms with glowing eyes. They weren't solid, but they felt real, their presence suffocating. One of them stepped forward, its voice echoing in my mind. "You've seen too much. You cannot leave." I tried to run, but the lights moved faster, blocking my path. They weren't just lights anymore. They were something far older, far more dangerous. I don't know how long I ran. The desert seemed endless. The lights always just behind me. I was disoriented, lost, my flashlight flickering as the batteries drained. My GPS was useless, the screen spinning in circles. When I finally collapsed, exhausted, the figures closed in. Their whispers turned to chants, low and rhythmic, filling the air with an oppressive hum. "You are ours now," they said. In my panic, I remembered something I'd read in a guidebook about Navajo folklore. A circle of protection, drawn in the sand, could ward off spirits. Desperate, I grabbed a rock and carved a crude circle around myself. The figures hesitated, their glowing eyes flickered, and the chanting faltered. "No!" they hissed, their voices filled with rage. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. As soon as they retreated, I bolted, running blindly through the desert until I found my RV. The engine roared to life on the first try, and I didn't look back as I sped out of the canyon. The whispers faded as I crossed the park's boundary, but the memory of those lights stayed with me. Back home, I developed the photos I'd taken during the trip. Most were ordinary shots of the stars and the canyon, but one image stopped me cold. It showed the lights, clear and vivid, dancing above the ruins like ghostly sentinels. I've kept that photo hidden, afraid of what it might mean. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear the whispers again, faint but persistent. "Come back, Finn. You belong with us." And sometimes I wonder if they're right.